Germanwings 18 Golf A, Marseille, do you read?
For more than a minute, controllers over southern France had been calling an Airbus A320 that was descending without clearance. No reply. At 30,000 feet and falling, the autopilot remained engaged. The engines were at idle. The speed was increasing. On board were 150 people. Most of the passengers still believed this was an ordinary morning flight home. Only a few meters ahead of them, one man was trying to get into the cockpit. The man outside that door was the captain.
Open the door! Let me in!
He had nearly 7,000 hours in the air. He knew how to recover this aircraft, and he could no longer reach the controls. The door had been reinforced after 9/11s to keep an attacker out. Now, that same protection was keeping the captain out. Behind it, the A320 was descending toward the French Alps at an average of 3,500 feet per minute. Investigators would later hear steady breathing on the cockpit recorder. No mayday. No answer to air traffic control. No attempt to stop the descent. This is the story of Germanwings Flight 9525 and of a cockpit door that worked exactly as it was designed to. Less than an hour earlier, at Barcelona El Prat, the same aircraft was preparing for an ordinary flight to Düsseldorf. An Airbus A320, registration D-AIPX, carried 144 passengers, 4 cabin crew, and 2 pilots. Nothing about the scene suggested that this flight would be different. The captain was Patrick Sondenheimer. He was 34 years old and had logged 6,763 hours in the air. 3,811 of them on the A320. His instructors rated his performance above standard. Beside him sat the 27-year-old co-pilot. He had 919 flying hours, including 540 on the A320. His instructors also rated him above standard. Pilots who had recently flown with him reported no concerns. On the crew roster, there were 2 qualified pilots assigned to a routine flight, but one crucial file existed outside the airline's view. In 2008, the co-pilot's training had been suspended after a severe depressive episode. Following treatment, he was cleared to return, but his medical certificate carried a condition. It would become invalid if the depression returned. Late in 2014, he began reporting vision problems and severe difficulty sleeping. Eye specialists found no physical cause. In the following months, private doctors treated him for anxiety and psychosomatic symptoms. By March, one physician suspected a possible psychosis and recommended psychiatric hospital treatment. Antidepressants and sleep medication were prescribed. Several sick leave certificates were issued. A 19-day certificate dated March 12th was never sent to Germanwings. It covered the day of the flight. Germanwings did not know. The captain beside him did not know. A diagnosis alone cannot explain a deliberate act. But operationally, one fact mattered. His fitness to fly had deteriorated, and the people scheduling him had not been told. And earlier that same morning, on the flight from Düsseldorf to Barcelona, the recorders captured something no one understood at the time. During the descent, the captain briefly left the cockpit. The co-pilot was alone. The selected altitude moved down to 100 feet, then up to 49,000, then back to the cleared altitude. Later, it returned to 100 feet several more times. Because of the autopilot mode then engaged, those selections did not alter the aircraft's path. The captain returned. The flight continued normally. Nobody noticed. The recorder data cannot tell us why he made those selections. But a little more than 2 hours later, the same selector would be turned to the same minimum. This time, the aircraft would follow it all the way down. At 10 o'clock local time, Germanwings Flight 9525 began its takeoff roll on Barcelona's runway 07.
Right.
The co-pilot was the pilot flying. The A320 climbed out over the Mediterranean and turned north toward France. Auto thrust was engaged. Then autopilot number 2. In the cabin, 144 passengers settled in for Düsseldorf. Among them were 16 students and 2 teachers from Halton MC, returning from a school exchange in Spain. At 12 minutes past 10, a flight attendant entered the cockpit. The 3 crew members briefly discussed the stop in Barcelona. She left a few minutes later, and the pilots talked about their departure delay. Everything still sounded routine. At 10:27 and 20 seconds, flight 9525 leveled at 38,000 feet and contacted Marseille Control. 2.5 minutes later, the aircraft was cleared direct to a waypoint called Irma.
Direct Irma, merci. German trains 18 Golf.
Germanwings 18 Golf. It was the final transmission from the flight. 8 seconds later, the captain told the co-pilot he was leaving and asked him to take over the radio. The co-pilot acknowledged. A seat moved backward. The cockpit door opened. 3 seconds later, it closed. The captain was now outside. Nothing unusual had happened. The A320 was still level at 38,000 feet for another 26 seconds. 26 seconds after the cockpit door closed, the selected altitude changed in a single second, from 38,000 feet to 100, the lowest setting available on the A320. 1 second later, the autopilot entered open descent. Autothrust commanded idle, and the aircraft began a continuous, controlled descent. This was not an uncontrolled dive. The autopilot and autothrust remained engaged. The aircraft was following the command it had been given. The same minimum had appeared earlier that morning. The recorders cannot tell us why. This time, the selection remained. The cockpit door was normally locked. A normal code from outside only sounded a buzzer. A pilot inside still had to release it. An emergency code could unlock it after 15 seconds, but the LOC key switch disabled the keypad for 5 minutes. Selecting it again restarted the timer. The exact moment the switch was used was not recorded. Investigators could establish only that the co-pilot kept the door locked despite later requests from the keypad and interphone. At 10:33 and 47, almost 3 minutes into the descent, Marseille Control called. Flight 9525 was already passing 30,000 feet. Radio. Recreated. Germanwings 18 Golf, Marseille. Confirm the flight level you were cleared to. No answer. The silence was not inactivity. 35 seconds before the controller's first call, the speed control had been changed from managed to selected mode. The target was set to 308 knots while the aircraft was flying at 273. It then changed repeatedly. At 10:34 and 23, it rose to 323 knots. 8 seconds later, a 1-second access buzzer sounded inside the cockpit. 4 minutes and 7 seconds had passed since the captain left. It was most likely a normal request to return. Nothing happened. Marseille continued calling. By 10:35 and 1 second, flight 9525 was descending through 25,100 feet. 2 seconds later, the selected speed was increased to 350 knots, the highest value the crew could select. The aircraft eventually stabilized near 345. Now the cockpit was receiving calls from 2 directions. Marseille transmitted on multiple frequencies. From the cabin, the interphone sounded, the first of 4 calls. None received an answer. At 10:35 and 32, the recorder captured the first knocks on the cockpit door. Over the next several minutes, knocking was recorded on 6 separate occasions. At 10:37 and 13, the first distinguishable words came through the metal. A muffled voice asked for the door to be opened. Muffled recretion. Open the door. The door remained closed. The calls and knocking continued without an answer. Then, at 10:39 and 30, 96 seconds before impact, the sound changed. The cockpit recorder captured the first violent blows against the door. 5 separate groups of blows were recorded over the next 58 seconds. 3 seconds after the first violent blows, the flight data recorder registered small movements on the right side stick. They continued for 34 seconds, but were too small to disconnect the autopilot. They did not alter the flight path. Autopilot and autothrust remained engaged. The selected speed stayed at 350 knots. The cockpit recorder continued to capture breathing until a few seconds before the end. At 10:40 and 41, with 25 seconds remaining, the ground proximity warning activated. GPWS, terrain, terrain, pull up, pull up. It continued until the end. At 10:40 and 56, the master caution sounded. 4 seconds later, the master warning followed. The descent did not stop. 6 seconds later, at 10:41 and 6 seconds, the recorders stopped as Germanwings Flight 9525 struck the mountainside. all 150 people on board were killed. The cockpit voice recorder was recovered on the afternoon of the crash. The flight data recorder followed on April 2nd. Together, they allowed investigators to reconstruct the final minutes. The recorders revealed no aircraft failure that could explain the descent. The BEA concluded that the collision resulted from the deliberate and planned actions of the co-pilot while he was alone in the cockpit. But the report did not reduce the accident to a single diagnosis. It identified a chain of defenses that had failed. The co-pilot did not contact an aviation medical examiner or inform his employer. Several sick leave certificates were issued, but not all were forwarded to Germanwings. None of his private doctors alerted an aviation authority. German law protected medical confidentiality, but gave doctors no clear guidance on when a threat to public safety should override it. The information existed. It simply never reached anyone who could remove him from duty. Then there was the cockpit door. It had been reinforced to resist gunfire, fragments, and forced entry. Once it was kept locked from inside, the same protection made outside access impossible. Yet the BEA issued no recommendation to weaken or redesign it, because doing so could create a different security risk. Europe initially recommended keeping 2 people in the cockpit. In 2016, that blanket approach was replaced by operator risk assessments. More lasting rules followed: psychological assessment before line flying, confidential support programs, and testing for psychoactive substances. No single rule can guarantee that an event like this will never happen again. Safety depends on information moving between pilots, doctors, airlines, and authorities, before a closed door becomes the final barrier. The report ended with recommendations. In the Alps and in Halton, the loss is remembered in names. The door worked exactly as designed. What failed was the assumption that the threat would always be outside.